Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We had in the last presentation looked at the relationships which need to be established in a synergistic sense, in the sense of systemic consistency between the environment, the organization and the individual, if effectiveness is to be managed appropriately. We would like to continue this discussion into the concepts of delegation, which is a way of bridging growth of individual and growth of the organization, because when you delegate, you are delegating through individuals, and when you are delegating, you are delegating a set of tasks. So, individuals working through tasks in a situation where somebody superior has assigned some activity to somebody reporting to him, creates a concept of measuring effectiveness, bridging the two areas, and then we will see how it can be put in an organizational frame. So, delegation is therefore taken to be a process. It is not an act. It continues in a regular manner, and it continues in a manner where the entire process has to be operated through responsibility staying with the delegator, but the action being vested in the delegatee. It therefore becomes a dynamic and a flowing situation. Hence, there are at least two parties involved in the process: the delegator who delegates and the delegatee who receives. The delegatee is expected to act for and on behalf of the delegator. The delegator has to vest the requisite authority commensurate with specified levels of accountability. Now, this is a difficult task. When you delegate a task, you have to give to the person carrying out that task the commensurate authority, otherwise nobody is going to listen to him. But delegating to a person a task with commensurate authority by itself is half a step, because you cannot really exercise authority in an organizational frame without having some accountability for the authority which is vested in you. You will recall at an earlier stage I had talked to you of an information audit. We need to build into the system an accountability audit also. Unless you build an accountability audit, the measurement of effectiveness will always be limited, because we are in an era where results must be through accountable means, and means cannot be taken for granted. Many a times superior can delegate authority, but not the responsibility. So, we need to spend some time looking at the issues of delegation and development, and if you deal with the issues of delegation and development, then we have got to understand that delegation is very often practiced by the superior to prepare the subordinate for the next level of responsibility. And preparing the person for the next level of responsibility creates a situation where delegation is not for the sake of shedding tasks, but delegation is for the purposes of institutional development. Therefore, looking at delegation as an instrument of institutional development, delegation by the person who has invested in the organization, the person who holds the capital, to the professional, the task of running an organization then becomes the primordial task of delegation. The first delegation takes place where somebody says, in effect, it is my money, I am investing it, the losses will be mine, the gains will be mine, you are a professional, you are a professional manager, now you run the organization. Very often this is taken as an act in the private sector, and many people have seen this as an element of the redeeming features of the private sector. But like everything else, there are huge caveats here. This delegation is there even in the public sector. The money there belongs to the public. The public expresses its will and goes around the action points through the legislature or the parliament, which in turn has a system of working where cabinets exist, where there are chief ministers at the state level and where there is a prime minister at the central level, and they decide through the due processes to create a public sector enterprise. There also is a delegation on behalf of these people to the professional managers for running an organization, and they are supposed to develop the enterprise into a functioning whole. So, be it private sector, be it public sector, both of them begin with delegation of what could be called the primordial power, and yet experience has it that in many business houses the delegation is not to the professionals as it were, but the shareholders themselves have acquired the skills, the talent, the competencies of running an organizations. In other words, have developed professional skills. So, they are owner professional managers, and this trend is growing, because then there is nothing suo motu in a person who has the capital also doubling up as a professional manager, and vice versa. There are cases where professional managers who began as professional managers have subsequently decided to set up an enterprise of their own and have gone entrepreneurial. So, that case has a process reversal, as it were, and people who have professional skills get the capital and set up an enterprise. There is no delegation there then. So, it is that the process of delegation has many shades of meaning, many layers, and no oversimplification will do justice to the concept of understanding the multiple manifestations of the delegation process. Then there are other manners of delegation. Typically, the business house, it is conventional to refer to private enterprises as business houses, but public enterprises can also be business houses because they transact business. So, it is a question of the meaning you attribute to the word business, but irrespective, what happens is when subsidiaries are created, the holding company delegates to the subsidiaries certain prerogatives and then incorporates the results into its own, and the performance of the subsidiary then becomes a part of the performance of the overall holding company. This strategy, where the growth of a subsidiary becomes the growth of a holding company, is also a delegation of sorts. And the larger proposition is, in each case, the human element is involved, and so is the structural component of an enterprise action. There are other layers to this discussion to which I would like to draw your quick attention. The holding companies in public sector have been set with the aim of increasing the delegation. So, at least in public sector, there is a virtue attributed to delegation, at least so far as the managerial principles are concerned. Though in practice, it has been noticed that in public sector also, the will of the top management often reflects itself in an implicit manner on the actions of the subsequent levels of management. Be that as it may, it is important to understand that a holding company in the public sector can afford to practice delegation in a wider sense than the private sector, because after all is said and done, the public accountability of the public sector is definitely higher than the public accountability of the private sector. In the same breath, it needs to be pointed out that with the increasing role of SEBI or the other regulatory agencies, the pristine autonomy of the private sector now is in many ways hemmed in by the compulsion to put the operation of the private sector in the framework of the will of the regulatory agencies. So, what is it that is happening for effectiveness in some of the clusters of enterprise and corporate functioning, be it private, be it public, be it joint venture, or what is becoming very popular now today in terms of reference, public private model. One is noticing a certain effort at disaggregation of very large public enterprises into smaller enterprises. But historically, this is not a new process which is unprecedented in terms of antecedents. Remember how Fertilizer Corporation of India was segregated into different fertilizer units. So, nothing needs to be read beyond a point in these patterns, and one should confine oneself to the focus of this presentation, namely elaborating upon the effectiveness parameter of assessment of organizations, to make sure that one is somewhat familiar with what is it that makes an organization effective. Enterprises in both sectors, private as well as public, are using concepts of profit centers and cost centers with corresponding responsibility accounting system to increase delegation. Now, this is a very important concept, which is why I am projecting it on the screen. Enterprises in both the sectors, that is public sector and private sector, are using concepts of profit centers and cost centers, which corresponding responsibility accounting accounting systems to increase delegation. To put it simply, therefore, in operational terms, delegation has become an instrument of management and, as has been pointed out, operates both through the individual and through the structural components. Delegation is potentially the greatest encouragement that many institutions can offer for individual development. Power is a basic driving force, and the option of exercising power on behalf of the organization is important inasmuch as it caters to one of the basic and natural instincts for action, which is why in many organizational management, organization behavior courses, the study of power and authority is an integral part of the exercise. Indeed, self-development through delegation leads to high motivation, low resistance, economies of psychic self-development. This is a proposition which very often is true, but is not a universal recipe. Why do I say that it is not a universal recipe? The reason for that is simple. If delegation alone and single-handedly could cause high motivation, low resistance and economies of various order, then motivating people would be the least problematic effort, and one will only have to delegate and the problem of motivation is solved. To carry the argument further, one needs to understand that there are difficulties in delegation, and in fact, the results cannot always be either programmed or indeed predicted. What are some of the basic underpinnings of human behavior which are well acknowledged, though they may not be universally true? First, let us talk of the delegator. The delegator may be unwilling to delegate, because the sheer feeling of people coming to you to make a request, to persuade you, to convince you and make you feel important is indeed one of the very sought after perquisites which arise out of being in authority. It gives a great sense of purpose to many people, especially those with fragile egos, especially those who haven't been oriented in proper use of authority or power. But that is not a discussion we can get into here. What I am trying to put across to you is a simple proposition. For whatever reasons, psychological, social, personal, you name it, the delegator may be unwilling to delegate. After all, what is the point of rising to a particular level and then discovering that all the powers which were vested in you are anyhow meant to be exercised by people other than you? Then there can be issues of the delegator unable to delegate. He is unable to delegate because the risks are very high, and if the act went wrong, his head would roll and he is not willing to walk through that. And there is another shade of inability which is perhaps worse. The delegator has no skills of delegating. He does not know how to delegate. A typical example would be he delegates the tasks, does not delegate the control over resources. So, the person has to keep coming back to him to get access to the resources. It is amazing where people's sense of power get tickled. I have known CEOs of enterprises worth or institutions worth more than 100 crores of operation, keeping with themselves the prerogative of allocation of the cars as to which car will go where and with whom through the day. And when I asked why the seemingly trivial task was still vested in the CEO, who presumably should have had better things to do, the reply, as you can imagine, was a classical one. Will you see, doc, if I were to give the prerogative to my subordinates, there will be huge misuse and there will be tremendous wastage. Now, that is an answer which I was not willing to argue with. What went through me is, if you have as a CEO, a COO, that is Chief Operating Officer, a person who can't be even trusted to be objective and scientific in the allocation of cars through the day, and you are worried about misuse and you are worried about losses. Why on earth do you have such a person as a CEO? I can't understand. But I was not willing to push for that discussion beyond the point, because as we all know, pushing for a perspective beyond a point with a person who is basically not in sympathy with that perspective is straining the relationships considerably. I have been so far talking to you about the delegator. The same two options of unwillingness and inability or inability, choose your word, applies to the delegate T. The delegate T may be unwilling to accept the tasks delegated to him, because the approach is very simple. Why should I add to my work? I am quite happy doing what I am supposed to do. My salary is not going to increase. My time commitment to work will increase. My risk of being faulted increase, and how does it matter to me? So, why should I accept any delegation? And there are many people who turn down what is delegated to them only because they do not want to take on that extra work. And like in the case of the delegator, there is this other dimension of the delegatee being unable or incapable of discharging the tasks, which, like in the case of delegator, I told you is an infinitely more worrying proposition, because this raises huge issues of skill, competency and ability to operate the system. If that be accepted, then there is a managerial prerequisite of delegation, and the managerial prerequisite really is prepare your subordinates to receive authority and power, and if you do not prepare your subordinates to receive authority and power, then when you do delegate, it may misfire. In operational terms, field experience has very often showed that especially at the top level, action points are given to a delegatee in domains where the delegatee really does not have any experience, but given his seniority he is not willing to accept it, and worse, his superior is keen to delegate because there is a risk involved in that action and the superior does not want to have the primary responsibility if anything goes wrong. To sum up, therefore, this part of the discussion, effectiveness parameters, if sought through the instrument of delegation, have several inbuilt constraints, and those constraints will have to be negotiated and worked through before progress can be registered. And typically, there can be delegator unwillingness, there can be delegator inability, there can be delegatee unwillingness, and there can be delegatee inability. More can be said, but just about on every topic more can be said. For the purposes of our present elaboration, this should work. But then the story does not conclude. A misfired delegation will cause the delegator to lose faith, and this loss of faith may hurt his values to a point where once bitten, twice shy becomes the rule. You delegated a couple of times, it did not seem to work because it misfired, and you had to do the mopping up, and you had to step in, and you had to do it anyhow in much less time. So, next time an opportunity comes to delegate, you are triply conscious and you do not really want to. I would urge potential managers and practicing managers to desist from this pitfall, and the reason for this is very simple. Let me put it in a light-hearted way, but you will remember the example. Remember the first time you fell in love and the love turned sour. Love has a strange propensity to turn sour. But did that prevent you from falling in love all over again? And yet again? And if I might say so, yet again? Now, if you do not stop falling in love merely because it turns sour, why do you stop delegating if it turns sour? Now, you might feel amused at that analogy, but the analogy is extremely relevant. It is rooted in two observations, and both of them serious social science observations. First is, if one social science experiment, in this case with managerial overtone, misfires, you do not assume that the same causative factors will be available in the second experiment. And the scientific basis for that is very simple. It will be a different person as a delegatee there. He may not botch it up. 2. Delegation is the logical way of multiplying yourself and raising effectiveness. It cannot be abandoned only because it turned sour. It is like saying, because an aircraft has a crash, you call off the flights of all other aircrafts. The done thing would be to find out why that aircraft crashed, and the done thing would be to take preemptive measures to ensure the flights of other aircrafts, and that is the art of management. The same thing applies to delegation. If delegation does not work out, find out why it did not work out, and please put in place, please install ways of making it work. The principle of delegation is without question worthwhile, and it needs to be pursued to make management work as it should. So, I have been discussing with you a situation where the delegator lost faith. There can be an equal situation where the delegatee has lost faith, and the delegatee feels that he is never given proper authority. He is always holed up for targets which he could not achieve because they were not achievable. And what is more, it creates all types of jealousies at a peer level. It is just not worth it. He loses faith in receiving delegation. And that is an equally sad situation for the organization. But it is my case that before practicing delegation, one should be clear that delegation per se is a sound principle of multiplying time, training people, creating a culture of confidence and accountability, and therefore, if there is a loss of faith at the delegator level or the delegatee level, it needs to be analyzed and cleaned up. One of the other limitations could be organizational rejection. The organization as such does not enable delegation to be practiced, because the person to whom the authority has been delegated is either unable to exercise the delegation or is unable to understand how to negotiate it. In either case, it is necessary to prepare the organization to take it forward. That brings us to the study of behavioral dynamics of the delegation and the delegator. Take a look at this slide, and then I will be walking you through. I have been talking to you about the inability, unwillingness, reservations of the delegator and the delegatee, and I thought it useful to elaborate in a projection mode some of the contributory factors which lead to unwillingness and inability on the part of the delegator. Unwillingness would be because of need of power, I have already referred to it. It may be lack of confidence, it may be fear of better performance by subordinates. So, the superior does not want to be upstaged. This is a bigger truth in organizational life than most people suspect. there is in many people tremendous reservation against talent. And I will cite to you two illustrations of this, which will help you to understand where there would be unwillingness on the part of the delegator. Talent has a strange way of manifesting itself, and if the superior does not have the necessary confidence in his own position, his own ability, or necessary confidence in his role to develop people, he will be very worried about delegating to a person who he knows is more capable than him, because his fear may be he may acquire greater respect and task discharge than the person who delegated power to him. I will narrate to you a hypothetical situation where a deputy director of an institution was a very powerful and a capable man. The director of that institution was neither that capable nor that powerful. So, for all practical purposes, the tail was wagging the dog, and people knew that it is the deputy director who matters. Once the deputy director decided to go on leave. So, people asked, who will officiate when the deputy director is on leave? And the answer came, the director, of course. In other words, when the deputy director is on leave, the director will officiate for him. Now, if you see the irony of the place and the irony of the situation, you will understand the parody. There is a fear of better performance by the subordinate, and the superior does not want to risk it. In that situation, there will be unwillingness of the delegator. Similarly, there will be inability of the delegator, because the person is incapable of planning. The person has administrative weakness. The person has weak communication. All these are possibilities, and the superior officer has limitations of planning, has limitations of administrative ability, has weak communication, then you can rest assured he will be reluctant to delegate. And finally, there is loss of faith. If I delegate, I will be upstaged. There is perceived disloyalty, perception that delegation cannot work in India, which I would rather not discuss, because perceptions are not often correlated to reality, but in any discussion on management, it is just as well to document the observation. Similarly, for the delegatee, the unwillingness may cover dissatisfaction with the reward and working conditions. So, why should I accept it? After all, there is no reward in my doing it, so I do not want to do it. Very commonly heard, a little childish perhaps, because people accept reward almost task for tasks, which can never be the situation. But I do not want to enter into a debate on that. I am, like in many other things, expressing it clinically, so that you can understand what would lead to a behavioral rejection by the delegatee of the opportunity to receive delegation. And remember, whether this is inability on part of the individual receiving the delegation or individual giving the delegation, it really affects effectiveness. Another reason for this delegatee's unwillingness to accept delegation would be the long standing dependency relationship. He has always been so dependent upon the superior that he just can't handle power when it is given to him. Further, inability is sustainability of his knowledge, skills and attitudes, and he does not know whether he will be able to keep up with it, which is why it is called inability. Lack of leadership competencies, he is just not a leader. So, there is no point in delegating to him. And finally, like in the case of a delegator, there can be loss of faith, that is frequent interference, intolerance of excessively severe punishment, and in both cases this can lead to loss of faith. Now, there are dynamics of limitations of delegation in the organizational frame, and I am sure you saw it coming, because if I was discussing the personality, I was also going to get into a discussion on the structural process components of the organization to look at issues of delegation and see how it affects effectiveness, and I will walk you through this in a brisk manner, because some of this you may already have anticipated in light of the discussions which we have had. And the limitations of delegation structurally would be unclear roles. This is a structural limitation to delegation. Another limitation in the structure for delegation would be inappropriate span of control. Be it unclear roles or be it inappropriate span of controls, both of them would limit the act of delegation. In terms of processes, there can be structural constraints by way of low motivation, sharp conflict, poor interpersonal relations, defective intergroup cooperation. Not the best place to get into an extended elaboration, but the larger point you have to understand is the process factor in the organization may be less than perfect, therefore, may prove to be an impediment in causing delegation, which in turn will have its effect on the effectiveness of parameters of the organization, and therefore, processes have to be tuned up if you want effective delegation to take place. There can be other constraints, and they can be under the heads control or plan or information. Control can be a factor in limiting delegation, because there can be partial or distorted information. Control can be a factor in making delegation redundant, because there is an absence of control data. In both cases, whether it is partial or distorted information or absence of control data, delegation will be imperfect, because the person who is getting the delegated parts, the delegatee, will not have the necessary wherewithal to deliver. Similarly, if the organization has a lack of or deficiency in a wider planning process, delegation will not work. And in having a wider planning process, you will have to have a place in it for delegated action. There may be a simple lack of awareness of the advantages of delegation. So, people do not see the significance and are not up to handling it. Unsystematic generation and use of data, inadequate joint planning and control are all factors which would require you to understand that information has an overrole in action points so far as delegation is concerned. That brings us to summing up of the factors which make delegation effective. Develop confidence in self, repose faith in the delegatee, prepare him for increased responsibility, adopt systemic discipline of planning and control, develop own vision of self actualization beyond the ego, and you have got delegation going, you have effectiveness reinforced, and you have at hand a recipe for success. And the same would apply for a delegatee, where the list would include developing vision for self actualization beyond utilitarian bargaining, develop confidence in self, overcome guilt in exercising legitimate authority, understand delegators' anxiety and be open to feedback and counseling, seek opportunities for training and development. Let me leave this here for a while to make sure you grasp the full implication of it, because for making delegation effective, be it the delegatee or be it the delegator, these elements are extremely important, not only for making delegation effective, for making the organization effective, which again, as I told you, would require efficiencies and excellence in everything. In a systems frame, delegation can be impaired if the control patterns are partial or distorted because of inadequate information. The delegatee may not be able to perform because he never had the information which he was looking for. There can be an absence of control data. If you do not have the control data, then you are not in a position to have any idea of the interventions which you as a person in authority are meant to exercise. So far as plans are concerned, if there is an absence of a wider planning process in the organization, then delegation will not work, because systemic integration across the vertical will be absent. And indeed, you may have a plan, but you are not even aware of what the plans are. In many organizations, there is nothing wrong with the planning process, but there is every deficiency in the awareness of the plan, both longitudinally and laterally. Furthermore, unsystematic generation and use of data will create a situation where ineffective delegation will be the rule and inadequate joint planning and control would be the result. One then moves on to the ways of making delegation effective and the organization effective, and I want to run you through certain concerns which will make the delegator effective, and I will then show to you certain concerns which will make the delegatee effective, and conclude with an analysis of certain concerns which will make the institution more effective if they are practiced. First, let me project it, and then I will try to put in a few words of explanation. If you read the 5 ideas listed there, which help to make the delegator effective in a delegation situation, the first one would be developing confidence in self. The second would be repose confidence in the delegatee. The third would be prepare him for increased responsibility. The fourth would be adopt systematic discipline of planning and control. And finally, develop own vision of self actualization beyond the ego. If you are a delegator with these traits, you will find that you will be able to make the organization more effective by the act of delegation. Similarly, for the delegatee, there are 5 suggestions. develop vision for self-actualization beyond utilitarian bargaining, develop confidence in self, overcome guilt in exercising legitimate authority, understand delegators' anxiety and be open to feedback and counseling, seek opportunities for training and development. And if you read these 5 elements carefully, you will notice that you have the makings of an effective delegate. However, to clinch the issue, you need institutional instruments of making delegation effective and thereby making for a more effective organization. And that is where the discussion on effectiveness will be concluding, but let me draw your attention to 4 propositions which are worth internalizing. Create and sustain long term vision of corporate development, then an organization is effective. No organization can survive from day to day, it must have a long term vision. There needs to be faster role clarity, constructive human relations and positive organization culture. That should be observed. Faster role clarity, because roles keep evolving. Constructive human relations. Relationships between people should be based on faith and operational significance and positive organizational culture. There should be no nitpicking. Even if errors are made, make sure you support the other person to higher levels of performance. Demand that managers use proper systems of control, and remember the word control here is a concept of keeping an organization on track. And finally, include effective delegation and subordinate development as criteria and performance appraisal. Now, if you have these 4 ideas ingrained in your institutional operation, you have at hand an operational situation which is conducive to effectiveness. It is not by any means an exhaustive repertoire of ideas, but in listening to what I have had to say on making an organization effective, or what is really termed as dealing with efficiency and excellence, converging on effectiveness of the organization, you will have had some intervention suggestions, some behavioral modification suggestions and some organizational development suggestions, which will help you not only to understand what is effectiveness, but help you to see more clearly the measures of effectiveness, which is the ultimate conclusion of all managerial action.